welcome back. This is very exciting. We've got technology running wild in here right now because I have CT, there's a Freudian slip there, Matt. CT House Representative from the 147th, Matt Blumenthal on Zoom with me right now. So, hey, Matt, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Thank you for having me, Trevor.
Oop, I am not hearing the sound, Bob.
I'm not either.
We're not here. Oh, we might have a sound issue here. Hold on.
Are you hearing me now?
I heard him before. So just while we're kind of fixing our sound for a second, Matt is joining us. He has taken a few minutes out from being on the floor, the legislative floor today. Matt, try talking again, if you will.
Hi, Trevor. Can you hear me now?
You got it. All right. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Bob Small is doing our technology. Anyway, so you've taken a break. You're talking to us. What are the issues you want to talk about? You mentioned energy, women's reproductive rights, and something else, but let's start with those two.
Yeah, so we're having a very busy session. I'm actually in a judiciary meeting right now for referred bills, but pushing our bills to the floor. We've got about a month left in session with lots of priorities to get over the finish line. Two important areas where we need to do some legislation are, first of all, excuse me, energy costs, which have been top of mind for pretty much everyone in Connecticut over the past year, if they weren't for a long time before that. Obviously, Connecticut energy costs and especially electricity costs are far too high. We have the second highest electricity costs in the nation. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But the bottom line is that it's unacceptable and unsustainable. And so I've been working on several pieces of legislation that would increase the accountability, oversight, and transparency that we put on our public utilities and the bills that you get every month from them. Some of those are in the Energy Committee. Some of them are in my committee, the Government Administration and Elections Committee. And one of them in particular that folks in Greenwich in particular, or Fairfield and Bridgeport might have a connection to is a bill on the Siting Council, which
that's a big deal. Right.
We've known for a while is a significant issue. There was an issue a number of years ago in Greenwich where I believe the Eversource wanted to run big monopoles through, I think it was Bruce Park. Ultimately, after Greenwich challenged them in court, the court found in favor of Greenwich and found that Eversource had to underground most of that array. And then there was another issue recently in Bridgeport, Fairfield, and Southport where United Illuminating wanted to run a bunch of monopoles through historic districts, through key economic zones.
It would have been a catastrophe for that neighborhood. I actually brought my kids up in Southport, know the Southport Congregational Church well, as a member. So that would have been horrendous to have these monopoles literally looming over these beautiful buildings. It would have been horrible.
Yeah, and we passed a bill last year to address some of the issues that came to the fore in that controversy. I worked with Jennifer Leeper from Fairfield and Steve Staffstrom from Bridgeport. And Jonathan Steinberg from Westport. And we crafted a bill to try to help ensure that a situation like that doesn't happen again. Ultimately, a court, unrelated to our bill, but interpreting existing law, struck down that plan recently. And so it's back to square one. And we're very hopeful that UI will come forward if there is a plan that has to happen with one that's far more cooperative rather than imperious and in trying to impose their will on these communities. But more generally, more generally, there's serious issues with the Siting Council process more generally, especially
overall, of course,
regarding to costs. Yeah, you have, we may know that these monopole projects would have had devastating consequences to these communities, but what we don't know is whether they're actually necessary in the first place, because the Siting Council doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the technical expertise, and sometimes not the independence to make a determination about whether these projects are worthwhile, whether they're necessary, whether they're in the best interests of Connecticut consumers.
So who does that oversight? Who is going to say, this is what you need to go through Southport? And I remember seeing there were different options. There's 3 options they presented. Of course, the most expensive, going underground, takes longer. But there's one that you go on the bonnets of the train or the train poles, right? And I don't know what now they've ended up doing or thinking of doing, but who makes those decisions ultimately?
It's the siting council.
Yeah.
And for far too long, they've been considered, at least by public reputation, a rubber stamp for the utilities. And so
Oh.
we want to make sure that they have the resources and expertise they need to vet these projects thoroughly. And part of one of the bills we're working on to do that, what it does is it beefs up the Office of the Consumer Counsel, which is the people's lawyer in these proceedings. And the office has a tiny budget and it has a huge impact. For every dollar we spend on the OCC, it saves roughly $70 to ratepayers. So we need a strong advocate in those proceedings to stand up for the ratepayers, to hold the utilities accountable, to make sure that all these projects are well justified and the least costly and the best alternative for our energy future. We need to increase the siting council's capabilities and the OCC's capabilities in order to do that.
That's great. It's really good work. Now, we did have Ryan Fazio on last week talking about public benefits and transparency, et cetera. Any thoughts from you on the things that Ryan, I said to him, I do know that a bunch of the public benefits was businesses that failed during the pandemic. This is not, individuals who are leaving other ratepayers to hold the bucket or whatever, the tab. And then the other part is, but if you now take it out of the public benefit, you're making all taxpayers deal with that. And this is actually people who are in Eversource. I don't know how many municipalities have their own power generation. I don't know how many people that is, but it seems unfair to those taxpayers.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the Republican ideas we've heard don't deal with the core of the issue of why public benefits, specifically, but more generally, energy has become more expensive in Connecticut and has become so outrageously expensive. They just kind of say, well, you shouldn't pay for it on your energy bill. We should pay for it in the budget. And you know what? Maybe there's an argument to be made about that, but that's ultimately an accounting issue. You're going to be paying for it one way or the other. What matters is the underlying charges and where they come from. In the case of the public benefits charge over the past year or so, the reason why it's increased so much has very little to do with kind of, quote, public benefits you think of. This is basically policy that's been imposed, not necessarily even by us, that has to be accounted for in your bill. Roughly 75% of that cost increase comes from the Millstone deal from 2017, where we agreed to subsidize the Millstone power plant. And I wasn't there at the time. If I were, I would not have voted for it. But I think most people agree it was not a good deal, not just because of the subsidy, but because we in Connecticut agreed to pay the subsidy on our own. New England, all of New England, and especially Massachusetts, gets power from Millstone. We're actually a net exporter of power, but we are paying 100% of the subsidy to keep Millstone open. And that to me is unacceptable. That's the biggest chunk of the increase in your electricity bill. And it's in the public benefits charge, but it's really supply.
Right, supply. So again, I don't think a lot of people realize this, that 75% of that increase. However, I do believe this rolls off in the fall. Am I correct? That subsidy goes away September-ish, or am I wrong?
The exact timing is uncertain, but it should be something that goes away over time. And part of it is because of the fact that we pay it only when the cost of other forms of electricity are less expensive. And part of it comes from the way in which Eversource and UI are being reimbursed for electricity that comes from Millstone. So if the reimbursement piece is complicated because it's more about timing, but eventually this cost should decrease. The other piece of the cost increase came from, as you mentioned, primarily businesses that failed during the pandemic that could not pay their electricity bill. And it is the law. You can, contest it if you like. It is the law here and in virtually every state that unpaid electricity arrearages get paid back ultimately by the ratepayers. But in this case, the big problem was not just that these arrearages are being paid back, it's the timing. Eversource and UI wanted those arrearages to be paid back over only 10 months.
Oh,
Meanwhile, Marissa Gillette on Pura wanted them to be paid back over 36 months.
wow.
Ultimately, she was outvoted. The utilities won. They got their accelerated reimbursement. They got their money sooner. And that is another reason why your electricity bill was so much higher over the past 9 months to a year, is because not just because you're paying back these arrearages primarily for businesses that failed during the pandemic, but because you're paying it back along with all of us on an accelerated timeline that the chair of Pura opposed, but ultimately she was outvoted on, and the utilities won.
Unbelievable. And again, there's so many parts, so many moving parts of all this stuff. And ultimately, we do need Millstone. We need nuclear power. It was about to be mothballed, if I believe this is correct. And now we're talking about figuring out ways to like increase its power capacity, because we do want a state that has data centers, but our energy is far too expensive, right, to support a data center. And we can't be on the on the forefront, the vanguard of AI without data centers. So I know you guys are all tackling what appears to be impossible situation, but we got to deal with it. We've got EVs and heaters, and it goes on and on. We need more electricity. The one thing I did mention is I'm aware that and I said this to Ryan, there's a cable going down the middle, or in the process of going down the middle of Lake Champlain to bring more power from Canada, hydro for us. But of course, now we have tariffs. And it should have been a clean, very inexpensive source of power. And here we are. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we need to get more power supply into Connecticut, especially clean power, however we can. And this would be a great option, hydropower from Canada. It's clean, it's environmentally friendly, and it would increase the supply here in Connecticut. And, some of the problems we have are related to oversight, but some of them are related to just the fact that we are an energy cul-de-sac and less energy flows through Connecticut. So we need to get more energy here. Hydropower is a great option. These tariffs could be a significant obstacle to that. And so, among all the other terrible effects the tariffs and the instability around them is having on the economy, there's this additional problem that they could prevent us from having an option of decreasing costs.
This is really frustrating. And I do want people to understand that you may not feel these tariffs right now in your pocketbook, but truly they're actually hitting everybody now, but it's only going to increase and accelerate over time. All right. So moving directions a little bit to, of course, one of my passions, I guess, is reproductive health care. And you, Matt, were one of the people who created that bill. It was the Reproductive Freedom Act back in 2019 or 2020?
2022, actually.
Yeah. 2022. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm proud to be co-founder and co-chair of the Reproductive Rights Caucus, and we've had a lot of accomplishments over the years. But one of the ones we're proudest of is having the first in the nation reproductive healthcare shield law called the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, which we passed in 2022. And since then, 16 states and the District of Columbia have passed their own laws based on our law, it was cool to be a leader on that. As we go forward, we need to have not only the first shield law in the nation, but also the strongest shield law in the nation. And so some of the bills we have this session that we're supporting on the Reproductive Rights Caucus are attempting to strengthen our shield law to make sure it covers all the relevant providers, to make sure it covers all the relevant helpers and individuals who come here for care, regardless of how they do that, and also ensure that all the individuals who get that care can have their data protected, their personal health data properly protected.
So incredibly important. So there is a case, I believe, in the state of New York where a Texas judge is suing a provider. And how is that impacting the way you guys are crafting your laws? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there was a case recently in which a Louisiana prosecutor is attempting to prosecute a New York doctor who provided telehealth reproductive health care, specifically related to medication abortion from New York. And basically, Louisiana tried to get New York to share information about that New York doctor. And New York has a shield law that is based on our shield law. I actually worked directly with the leaders of their pro-choice caucus to help when they passed it. And so far, so good. The law has been found to be applicable. The New York judges have said, no, New York State courts are not going to help you prosecute this case, Louisiana. This doctor is protected under our laws. And so we on the Reproductive Rights Caucus here in Connecticut are watching this case closely because we want to make sure that our law does everything we need it to do. And if there are any lessons learned, if there are any gaps recognized, we want to make sure we take advantage of the opportunity to fill them.
We are so grateful for you and your team on the legislature. Is Julie Kushner is the other co-chair? Who is the other person writing that?
Jillian Gilchrist, but
Jillian
Julie
Gilchrist,
Kushner,
sorry.
yeah, so Representative Jillian Gilchrist from West Hartford is my co-chair, but Julie Kushner, Senator from Danbury, has also been an instrumental supporter of reproductive health care. And she's been a really powerful advocate helping us get a lot of great bills done.
Well, thank you for your service, and we all need you, every single one of us. And I did hear of a horrifying case where a woman miscarried, I think literally outside of her apartment building, and was arrested for the death of her fetus, and is now being prosecuted for homicide. So we are in a dire place right now in this country that women can't access proper, in many places in our country, proper reproductive, not women, I should say, all people can't access reproductive health care. So what you're doing is incredibly important. Okay, what else would you like to address today?
Well, there's a lot of really important issues in the legislature this year, but one of the most important among them is expanding access to the ballot. This past fall, Connecticut voters overwhelmingly approved a constitutional amendment to allow for absentee voting for all. In other words, allowing every eligible voter to vote absentee if they so wish. And this change is so important because we have some of the most restrictive absentee voting laws in the country. And that means that folks who work multiple jobs may not be able to vote. It means that folks who may take care of a sick relative may not be able to vote. It means that people who are commuting might not be able to vote. And so making sure that everyone can vote is vitally important. And so we passed the constitutional amendment this fall.
Oh, wow.
Now we have to actually put it into law because we still have a statute that has all the reasons you can get an absentee ballot. And so this session, I'm hopeful that we'll pass implementing legislation for the constitutional change so that in the future, you'll be able to vote absentee, regardless of whether you have one of the specific reasons that has been set out in law in the past. If you want to vote absentee, you should be able to vote absentee.
I think it's great. Okay, are you going to come up with a shield law if the Senate, I know the House has already passed the SAVES Act at the federal level, which would require anybody who has changed their name due to marriage or whatnot, which would be, by the way, 87% of married women change their last names. So now to vote, if this SAVES Act happens, you have to show up with your birth certificate, the marriage, the divorce, the change in, like whatever it is that is impacting to your name. I have been married and divorced 3 times, Matt. I've changed my name 3 times. Do you know how many pieces of paper I'm going to have to bring with me to vote? Is there anything you can do, any shield law that we can implement in our state if this is to happen?
Well, I think you very vividly demonstrated how ridiculous this proposed law is. And actually, in addition to the bill that is being pushed by U.S. House Republicans, the president issued an executive order basically ordering us to obey the provisions of the SAVE Act. And those provisions require you either to have a passport to vote or, as you mentioned, photo ID that matches your birth certificate. Now, 146 million Americans don't have a passport. 69 million women don't have photo ID today that matches their birth certificate, as you mentioned, mostly because they changed their name at some point in their life.
Yeah.
Often because they've taken their spouse's name at some point or another. And this would cause just absolute havoc. The Brennan Center estimates that roughly 9% of eligible voters would be disenfranchised. And so
incredible.
Yeah, it's just truly nuts. And so we are already fighting back against the executive order. The Attorney General William Tong has sued to block it and I believe successfully achieved a temporary restraining order. But ultimately, we're not going to follow that executive order one way or the other. if the quote SAVE Act, this bill that's in Congress right now, were to pass, it would be a tougher situation. We would still definitely fight back in the courts and to the greatest extent possible refuse to follow these egregious provisions, because the Constitution provides that states have the vast majority of power over the administration of elections. So we would certainly fight back in the courts. We would resist having to do anything, but ultimately, if the courts ordered us to do something, we'd have to follow those procedures that the courts ordered. But I think ultimately, not only these provisions in the so-called SAVE Act egregious and ridiculous, they're also unconstitutional. So I'm very hopeful that this bill will not pass the U.S. Senate. I believe that it won't, because it would need a filibuster or need to get past a filibuster. But we have to be on guard. This is just one of many attacks by the Trump administration on Connecticut, on our rights. There have been mass deprivations of funding cuts that are illegal. There have been all sorts of attacks on our ability to have our public schools teach what they think is appropriate to teach. There have been attacks on our LGBTQ community. There have been attacks on reproductive rights. And we need to fight back with every tool we have. And we do have a lot of tools in the legislature. And so I've been working along with my colleagues to try to make sure that those tools are applied to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, I mean, we're really going to hit a big hole, right, with this federal funding that's going to get cut to a huge degree. Really don't know what they're talking about for Medicaid. I saw that the Republicans introduced a bill that takes away this tax status for collecting bills through Medicaid through hospital tax. I don't know if you read about this in the New York Times this morning, but it will, and it won't just hurt us. It's certainly Nathaniel Witherall, which is right here in Greenwich, which we all love and adore, but that it may not last through this. But the red states are really going to be hurt by this particular move on the Republican side. And I'm like hands up in the air. Like, what are we going to do with this kind of thing? Any thoughts on Medicaid, or how do we fill these gaps? Or I don't know.
There's a lot of uncertainty right now. As you mentioned, the House Republicans, the congressional Republicans, are trying to pass a budget that would cut $880 billion from Medicaid. That would have devastating consequences for Connecticut, but especially for red states and rural areas that disproportionately rely on Medicaid to maintain their hospitals and their healthcare facilities.
It is just sad, like cruel. I'm really worried for people's health. And I'm worried about Connecticut specifically. I know that there's cutting on funding, special education. If your school teaches any DEI or any of that stuff, there's some incredibly petty cuts from the Doge group. I believe there's a very little tiny museum or library in Wilton that got like 20,000 cut from their budget because they had an Indigenous people exhibition, like a grant, just a basic thing. Like, it just is really crazy. I don't understand.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that these cuts, which are so reckless and frankly nihilistic, they have real effects on people's lives. They have real effects on institutions in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our communities here in Connecticut and across the country. And what you have is, a billionaire with tons of conflicts of interest and, a couple of 20-year-old coders running around acting like they know how the government works. They have no idea. And the cuts that they're making don't take anything into account that matters. We want government to run more efficiently. I think everybody can agree.
I agree with that too.
More efficiently.
But it's a good idea.
If you want it to run more efficiently, it has to run. You have to figure out how it works. And, there's a conversation to be had about how to make that happen. But we know there is one way that won't make it happen. And that is doing these kind of wholesale, indiscriminate cuts, not caring, what an agency or an institution does, just taking its funding. And that's what's been going on from Doge and Elon Musk.
It's mind-boggling. We're going to have to wrap up in a couple seconds, but I just wanted a shout out for your hard work to get you're part of the legal team that held Alex Jones accountable in the civil case brought against him by the Sandy Hook family. So thank you for your hard work on that. That's really important. Is there anything that you can recommend people listening today to do or get involved with? What would you like to see from our constituents?
Yeah, I think people can get involved directly by contacting their legislators on these issues that we've discussed today. I think you underestimate as a voter or constituent how much your state house member or state senator is actually listening to you. It is tough with a member of Congress or a senator to get to them directly because they have so many constituents, but with us, we have far fewer and we really care what you think. And so if you stand up and you reach out to your legislators to encourage them to fight back against these draconian measures, if you reach out to them, say, support these reproductive rights bills, if you reach out to them and say, support these bills to expand the vote and democratic participation, they're going to listen. And that's going to help us do better for the people of Connecticut.
That's great. Now, how do people find you, Matt?
So you can find me pretty easily online. Email is probably the best way and most direct way to do it. And it's just matt.blumenthal@cga.ct.gov. It's pretty easy. And if you Google me, you'll find it. But we read our emails. I read my email. I respond to most of it as soon as I can. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. It's important that we hear from you, and your advocacy can make a real difference.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show today. Next week we have Susan Beischowitz on. We're not sure. We're hoping. We're keeping our fingers crossed. But we have, we'll keep bringing some interesting, fun guests. Matt, we need you to come back on the show. You promise to return?
Love to.
Okay, cool. All right, we're going to go to some call-ins, see if anybody's doing it. We'll give it a shot. Bob's giving me a oh, nobody's calling. All right, so if you would like tickets for Avon Theater or a t-shirt or popcorn or all the above, you can call 203-661-5051 and see if anybody wants to give us a call. If not, I don't know, do we have a last thing you'd like to tell us, Matt? We have got about a minute and a half left.
Nothing specific, but just keep on engaging with the General Assembly, with your legislators. It is important. I think it is important on these energy cost issues to engage with us because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there about why we have these costs. And frankly, people who don't want change love the fact that it's so complicated to regulate energy in this state because they know that everybody,
it's complicated.
Their eyes just glaze over. We need to cut through the nonsense and get something done.
So thank you for rolling up your sleeves, caring about all of us and being in there and fighting hard. So Matt, take care and be well. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Trevor.